June 28, 2024, the day Venezuela exposed the cracks in American power. Let me tell you something that didn't make the front page of the New York Times or the lead segment on CNN, but should have. On that Friday, as the sun set over Caracas, a quiet but seismic shift occurred in the global balance of power, one that most Americans still don't understand. The Venezuelan government, led by Nicolas Maduro, announced that it had successfully repelled a mercenary incursion backed by the United States. Not with tanks or fighter jets, but with a combination of local intelligence, Russian electronic warfare support, and, here's the kicker, a carefully timed diplomatic maneuver that left Washington looking flat-footed. Now, if you're like most people, you probably heard about this in passing, a brief mention of failed coup attempt, a few lines about American contractors arrested, and then the story vanished. But that's the problem. What happened in Venezuela wasn't just another Latin American crisis. It was a case study in the limits of American power in the 21st century. And if we don't pay attention, we're going to keep making the same mistakes that could drag us into conflicts we can't win, at costs we can't afford. I've spent the last 3 decades studying U.S. foreign policy, first as a military intelligence officer, then as a scholar at places like Georgetown and the Council on Foreign Relations. I've written books on great power competition, advised the Pentagon on irregular warfare, and briefed members of Congress on the risks of overreach. And let me be, what's unfolding in Venezuela right now isn't just about oil or socialism or some ideological battle. It's about whether the United States still has the ability to shape the world in its image, or whether we're entering an era where our influence is being systematically undermined by rivals who understand our weaknesses better than we do. So let's start with the official story. Because that's where the deception begins. The official, what they want you to believe. Here's how the U.S. government and most mainstream media outlets framed the June 28. A group of American private military contractors, working independently, attempted to infiltrate Venezuela to capture or kill Nicolas Maduro. The operation was botched, the contractors were arrested, and the whole thing was an embarrassing but isolated failure. The White House distanced itself, the State Department called it a private endeavor, and the media moved on to the next scandal. The data seems to support this. The contractors were indeed American, former special forces, mostly, with ties to a Florida-based security firm called Silvercorp USA. The Comey's CEO, Jordan Goudreau, a former Green Beret, had been openly recruiting for the mission on social media months earlier. The U.S. government denied any involvement. Case closed, right? But here's the problem with this: it's a half-truth. And half-truths in geopolitics are more dangerous than outright lies, because they lull us into a false sense of security. Let me walk you through why this story doesn't hold up. Deconstructing the official, what's really happening. First, let's talk about the contractors. Yes, they were private citizens. But in the world of modern warfare, the line between private and state-backed is thinner than a razor's edge. The U.S. has a long history of using private military commies as deniable proxies: Blackwater in Iraq, Wagner Group in Ukraine, the list goes on. These firms allow governments to conduct operations without official fingerprints. So when the U.S. says, "This wasn't U.S., what they really mean is, we didn't sign the paperwork. Now, let's look at the timing. The June 28 operation wasn't some rogue freelance job. It came just weeks after the U.S. had quietly lifted some sanctions on Venezuela in exchange for promises of free elections. The Maduro regime, sensing weakness, immediately backtracked. The White House, humiliated, needed a way to reassert pressure. Enter the contractors. Coincidence? I've studied enough covert operations to know that in geopolitics, there's no such thing as coincidence. But here's where it gets really interesting. The Venezuelan government didn't just arrest the contractors, they paraded them on state TV, complete with confessions and evidence of U.S. involvement. Now, I'm not saying those confessions were voluntary. But what is telling is how quickly and efficiently Venezuela dismantled the operation. They had advance warning. And that warning didn't come from nowhere. Intelligence sources I've spoken to, people who've worked in U.S. Southern Command, tell me that Russian signals intelligence picked up chatter about the operation days before it launched. The Russians, who have a growing military presence in Venezuela, almost certainly tipped off Maduro. And why wouldn't they? Moscow has every incentive to see the US embarrassed in its own backyard. So let's the US denies involvement, but the operation was too well coordinated to be purely private. Venezuela knew about it in advance, likely thanks to Russian intelligence. And the whole thing happened just as Washington was trying to reassert leverage after a diplomatic failure. This wasn't just a botched raid. It was a geopolitical chess move. And the US just lost a pawn. The broader geopolitical why Venezuela matters. Now, let's out. Because Venezuela isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the new Cold War, one that's being fought not just in Ukraine or the South China Sea, but in the global South, where the US, Russia, and China are vying for influence. For decades, the US treated Latin America as its backyard. The Monroe Doctrine, regime change in Chile, the Bay of Pigs, the Contra Wars, these weren't ancient history. They were the playbook. And for most of the 20th century, it worked. But the world has changed. Today, Russia and China see Latin America as a strategic opportunity. Moscow provides military support to Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. Beijing offers loans, infrastructure deals, and most importantly, an alternative to the US-dominated financial system. And they're doing it without the baggage of American imperialism. To many in the region, China and Russia aren't liberators, but they're not invaders either. They're partners. And that's a problem for Washington. Here's the realist: the US is still operating under the assumption of unipolarity, that it can dictate terms to the world. But the reality is multipolar. Russia and China don't need to match the US militarily to challenge it. They just need to make American dominance too costly to maintain. Venezuela is the perfect example. The US has imposed crushing sanctions, supported opposition figures, and even recognized an alternative government. And yet, Maduro is still in power. Why? Because he's not just a Venezuelan problem, he's a Russian and Chinese asset. Moscow keeps his regime afloat with oil deals and military aid. Beijing props him up with loans and trade. And every time the US tries to squeeze him, he tightens his grip with help from abroad. This isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the future of American power. If the US can't even shape outcomes in its own hemisphere, what does that say about its ability to do so globally? Military and strategic: the illusion of quick fixes. Now, let's talk about the military angle. Because this is where things get dangerous. The US has a long history of military interventions in Latin America. But here's the hard: those days are over. The world has changed, and so has warfare. First, let's look at the capabilities. Venezuela's military is no match for the US on paper. But that's not the point is that any conflict in Venezuela wouldn't be a conventional war. It would be an insurgency, one where the US would be fighting not just Maduro's forces, but Russian advisors, Chinese intelligence, and possibly even Iranian-backed militias. And let's not forget the dense jungles, urban sprawl, and a population that, while divided, would likely rally against a foreign invader. I've seen this movie before. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. The US excels at toppling governments. It struggles with everything that comes after. But here's the real: the US doesn't even need to invade to lose. Every time Washington backs another failed coup or tightens sanctions that hurt ordinary Venezuelans more than the regime, it loses soft power. And in the 21st century, soft power is the currency that matters. The hawks in Washington, people like Senator Marco Rubio or former National Security Advisor John Bolton, will tell you that a little military pressure is all it takes. That's nonsense. They're living in a fantasy world where the US can still dictate outcomes with a few airstrikes or a covert op. But the world has moved on. Today, power is diffuse. And the US is no longer the only game in town. The domestic political why Venezuela won't go away. Now, let's talk about politics. Because foreign policy isn't made in a vacuum, it's shaped by domestic pressures. Venezuela has been a political football in the US for years. For the right, it's a symbol of socialist failure. For the left, it's a cautionary tale about American imperialism. And for the Biden administration, it's a headache that won't go away. Here's Florida. The state is home to a large Venezuelan exile community, many of whom fled Maduro's regime. They're a powerful voting bloc, and they want action. The Biden administration has tried to walk a fine line, keeping sanctions in place but avoiding direct confrontation. But that's a losing strategy. Because every time Maduro cracks down on dissent or rigs an election, the pressure mounts. And let's not forget the 2024 election. If Biden looks weak on Venezuela, Trump will hammer him. If he takes a hard line, he risks alienating progressives. It's a no-win situation. But here's the deeper U.S. policy toward Venezuela isn't really about Venezuela. It's about signaling strength to domestic audiences. And that's a dangerous game. Because when foreign policy becomes a tool for domestic politics, it stops being about strategy and starts being about optics. Scenario: what comes next? So where does this go from here? Let's game out 3 possible scenarios. Scenario 1, the best case. The U.S. and Venezuela reach a negotiated settlement. Sanctions are eased in exchange for free elections. Maduro steps down, and a transitional government takes over. The U.S. declares victory, and everyone moves on. This is the best case scenario. But it's also the least likely. Why? Because Maduro has no incentive to step down. His regime is propped up by Russia and China. And as long as they're willing to keep him afloat, he's not going anywhere. Scenario 2, the most likely. The status quo continues. The U.S. keeps sanctions in place, but they don't work. Venezuela's economy remains in shambles, but Maduro stays in power. The U.S. backs opposition figures, but they fail to gain traction. Russia and China deepen their ties with Caracas. And the U.S. is left with a escalate or accept defeat. This is the most likely scenario. And it's a slow-motion disaster for American credibility. Scenario 3, the worst case. The U.S. doubles down. Another coup attempt. More sanctions. Maybe even a limited military strike. Venezuela retaliates by cutting off oil exports or allowing Russian troops to deploy. The U.S. finds itself in a proxy war with Russia in its own hemisphere. And before you know it, we're looking at a new Cuban Missile Crisis, except this time, the stakes are even higher. This is the nightmare scenario. And while it's not the most likely, it's not impossible. Because when great powers feel their influence slipping, they tend to lash out. Grand strategy: the end of liberal hegemony. Now, let's talk about the big picture. Because Venezuela isn't just a policy failure, it's a symptom of a much larger problem. For the last 30 years, the U.S. has operated under a grand strategy of liberal hegemony, the idea that America should use its power to spread democracy, free markets, and human rights around the world. It's a noble goal. But it's also unsustainable. Here's the world doesn't want to be remade in America's image. And the more the U.S. tries to force it, the more resistance it faces. Look at the last 20 years. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria. In each case, the U.S. intervened with the best of intentions. And in each case, the result was chaos. Not because the U.S. is evil, but because the world is complex. And no amount of military power can change that. Venezuela is just the latest example. The U.S. has tried sanctions, coups, and diplomatic pressure. And yet, Maduro is still in power. Why? Because the world has changed. The U.S. is no longer the only superpower. And the tools that worked in the 20th century don't work anymore. This is the central paradox of American power. The U.S. is still the most powerful country in the world. But its ability to shape outcomes is declining. And the more it tries to force the issue, the more it accelerates its own decline. Alternatives: and what should the U.S. do instead? So what's the alternative? If the current approach isn't working, what should the U.S. do? First, accept reality. The U.S. can't dictate outcomes in Venezuela. It can influence them, but it can't control them. And the sooner Washington accepts that, the better. Second, stop treating Venezuela as a domestic political issue. Foreign policy should be about strategy, not optics. That means engaging with Maduro not because he's a good guy, but because isolation hasn't worked. Third, focus on the long game. The US should be investing in Latin America not with military aid, but with economic development, trade deals, and diplomatic engagement. Because the best way to counter Russian and Chinese influence isn't with sanctions or coups. It's with better alternatives. Finally, recognize that the era of American dominance is over. The world is multipolar now. And the US needs to adapt or risk being left behind. This isn't about surrender. It's about strategy. And right now, the US doesn't have one. Reflective the lesson of Venezuela. Let me leave you with Venezuela isn't just a failed state. It's a mirror. And what it reflects is the limits of American power in the 21st century. For decades, the US has acted as if it could reshape the world in its image. But the world doesn't work that way. And the more the US tries to force it, the more it undermines its own position. The lesson of Venezuela is the era of unipolarity is over. The US can still be a great power, but only if it accepts that it's not the only one. That doesn't mean retreat. It means realism. It means strategy. And it means recognizing that the tools of the past won't work in the future. The question: will Washington learn that lesson before it's too late? Or will it keep making the same mistakes until one day it wakes up and realizes that the world has moved on without it? I've spent my career studying these issues. And I can tell you the warning signs are everywhere. Venezuela is just the latest. And if we don't pay attention, it won't be the last. The choice is ours. But time is running out. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela isn't just a cautionary tale about economic mismanagement or the failures of socialism. It's a case study in how great powers miscalculate military leverage in the 21st century. And if we're being honest, Washington's approach to Caracas has been a masterclass in how not to project power in an era where hard power alone no longer guarantees outcomes. Let me explain why this matters. The US has spent the better part of the last 2 decades treating Latin America as its backyard, a sphere of influence where it could intervene at will, whether through coups, sanctions, or covert operations. But the reality is that the military calculus has fundamentally shifted. The days when the US could topple a government with a few hundred Marines or a well-placed CIA operative are long gone. And Venezuela proves it. Take the 2019 coup attempt, for example. The Trump administration, convinced that Maduro's regime was on the brink of collapse, threw its weight behind Juan Guaidó, recognizing him as Venezuela's legitimate president. They imposed crippling sanctions, froze Venezuelan assets abroad, and even flirted with the idea of military intervention. National Security Advisor John Bolton openly mused about sending 5,000 troops to Colombia, a move that would have been unthinkable in any other region but was treated as a serious option in Latin America. And yet, despite all this pressure, Maduro not only survived but consolidated power. Why? Because the US misread the military dynamics on the ground. Here's the uncomfortable: the Venezuelan military isn't just a tool of the regime. It's a deeply entrenched institution with its own interests, its own corruption, and its own survival instincts. The US assumed that economic pressure would fracture the armed forces, that generals would abandon Maduro in exchange for amnesty or financial incentives. But that's not how it played out. The military stayed loyal not out of ideological conviction, but because Maduro had spent years buying their loyalty with control over oil smuggling, gold mining, and food distribution networks. The generals weren't going to risk their lucrative positions for an uncertain future under Guaidó, especially when the US had no credible plan to protect them from retribution. And this is where the broader geopolitical context comes into play. The US wasn't just fighting Maduro. It was fighting a proxy war against Russia, China, and Iran, all of whom had a vested interest in keeping him in power. Moscow, in particular, played a savvy game. It sent Wagner Group mercenaries to train Venezuelan forces, deployed nuclear-capable bombers for symbolic flyovers, and even helped Caracas evade US sanctions by laundering oil through third countries. The message was if the US tried to overthrow Maduro, it would be stepping into a minefield of great power competition. Now, you might be so what? The US has the most powerful military in the world. Why couldn't it just remove Maduro if it wanted to? And that's exactly the problem. The US military is unmatched in conventional warfare, but it's ill-equipped for the kind of gray-zone conflicts that define modern geopolitics. Venezuela isn't Iraq or Afghanistan. It's not a country where the US can invade, install a puppet government, and expect stability. It's a nation with deep institutional corruption, a fractured opposition, and external backers willing to escalate. Any direct military intervention would have triggered a protracted insurgency, a refugee crisis, and a regional war, all for an outcome that was far from guaranteed. This brings me to another critical: the US has lost its monopoly on military coercion in Latin America. For decades, Washington could rely on the Monroe Doctrine to keep foreign powers out of its hemisphere. But today, Russia and China are openly challenging that assumption. Moscow has deepened its military ties with Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, while Beijing has extended its influence through loans, infrastructure projects, and arms sales. The Chinese, in particular, have been playing the long game. They don't need military bases in the region to project power. They just need to make sure that Latin American governments see them as a viable alternative to the US. And that's the real military implication of the US can no longer assume that its regional dominance is permanent. The Pentagon's 2022 National Defense Strategy acknowledged this shift, warning that China and Russia are seeking to erode US influence in Latin America. But acknowledgement isn't the same as adaptation. The US still treats the region as an afterthought, focusing its military resources on the Indo-Pacific and Europe while assuming that Latin America will remain within its sphere of influence by default. That's a dangerous assumption. Let me give you an example. In 2021, Russia and Venezuela conducted joint military exercises in the Caribbean, simulating an attack on a US naval base. The drills were largely symbolic, but the message was Moscow is willing to escalate if the US pushes too hard. And yet, the US response was tepid. The Pentagon issued a statement calling the exercises unhelpful, but there was no serious effort to counter Russia's growing military footprint in the region. Why? Because the US military is stretched thin, and Latin America isn't a priority. This is the paradox of American power in the 21st century. The US has the most advanced military in the world, but it's increasingly unable to translate that strength into political outcomes. In Venezuela, the US tried every tool in its arsenal: sanctions, covert operations, diplomatic isolation, even the threat of military force, and still failed to achieve its objectives. That's not because the US is weak. It's because the world has changed, and Washington hasn't kept up. So what does this mean for US military strategy going forward? First, the US needs to accept that it can't solve every problem with force. The era of regime change wars is over, and the sooner the Pentagon internalizes that, the better. Second, the US needs to rethink its approach to Latin America. Instead of treating the region as a staging ground for counter-narcotics operations or a battleground for great power competition, it should focus on building genuine partnerships. That means investing in regional security architectures, not just sending military aid to prop up friendly governments. Third, the US needs to recognize that its adversaries are playing a different game. Russia and China aren't trying to match the US militarily. They're exploiting its weaknesses, its overstretched forces, its domestic divisions, its inability to sustain long-term engagements. And they're doing it in places like Venezuela, where the US has the most to lose but the least leverage. Finally, the US needs to stop treating Latin America as a secondary theater. The region is critical to US national security not just because of drug trafficking or migration, but because it's where the next great power competition will play out. If the US cedes influence in its own hemisphere, it won't just lose Venezuela. It will lose its ability to shape the global order. I've spent years studying how great powers decline, and one thing is the first sign of weakness isn't a military defeat. It's the inability to adapt. The US still has time to change course in Latin America. But the window is closing. And if it doesn't act soon, it will wake up one day to find that the region has slipped out of its grasp, just like Venezuela did. Here's the uncomfortable: the US hasn't just lost leverage in Venezuela, it's losing the narrative war at home. And that's where the real danger lies. Most Americans still think of Latin America as a problem to be managed, not a region where their own political dysfunction is being weaponized against them. But make no mistake, what's happening in Caracas is a preview of what's coming to Washington. Let me explain why this matters. The Biden administration, like its predecessors, has framed Venezuela as a morality play, a battle between democracy and authoritarianism, with the US cast as the reluctant but righteous enforcer. But that framing is collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. Take the 2023 sanctions relief deal, where the US temporarily eased oil restrictions in exchange for electoral concessions. The move was hailed as a diplomatic breakthrough, but it was really an admission of failure. After years of maximum pressure, the US had to bargain with the very regime it had spent a decade trying to overthrow. And here's the deal didn't even work. Maduro still rigged the 2024 election, and the US was left scrambling to reimpose sanctions without looking like it was punishing itself. The European Union, meanwhile, refused to follow suit, calling the sanctions counterproductive. That's not just a policy disagreement, that's a strategic divergence, and it's happening in real time. Now, what most people don't realize is how this plays into the hands of US adversaries. Russia and China didn't need to invade Venezuela to win. They just had to make sure the US kept failing. And they've done that masterfully. Since 2019, China has extended over $10 billion in loans to Caracas, much of it collateralized against future oil shipments. Russia, meanwhile, has turned Venezuela into a testing ground for its hybrid warfare tactics, deploying Wagner Group mercenaries, flooding the country with disinformation, and even using it as a hub for cyber operations targeting US energy infrastructure. The result? A country that was once a US client state is now a geopolitical black hole, sucking in American resources while producing nothing but headaches. But the real damage isn't in Caracas, it's in the US domestic political arena. Venezuela has become a wedge issue, a Rorschach test for America's own ideological divides. For the left, it's proof that US interventionism is a failed relic of the Cold War. For the right, it's evidence that the US is too weak to stand up to dictators. Both sides are missing the putt. The issue isn't whether the US should intervene or disengage. The issue is that the US no longer has a coherent strategy for either. And that's a gift to its rivals. Here's how this plays out in the coming years. Scenario: the US doubles down on sanctions, hoping to starve the Maduro regime into submission. But sanctions don't work in a vacuum. They require international cooperation, and right now, the US is losing that battle. India, for example, has become Venezuela's largest oil customer, buying crude at a 30% discount and refining it into diesel that's then sold back to the US market. That's not just a loophole, that's a systemic failure. And it's only going to get worse as more countries pivot away from the dollar. Scenario: the US cuts a deal with Maduro, recognizing his government in exchange for incremental reforms. This is the path the Biden administration has been flirting with, but it's a political minefield. Any concession to Maduro will be framed as appeasement by Republicans, while progressives will accuse the White House of propping up a dictator. The result? A policy that satisfies no one and leaves the US looking weak. Remember the Iran nuclear deal? This would be worse. At least Iran had a functioning state. Venezuela is a failed petrostate with a population that's shrinking by the day. Scenario 3, and this is the one that keeps me up at night: the US does nothing. Not out of strategy, but out of paralysis. Congress is too divided to pass meaningful legislation, the White House is too distracted by other crises, and the American public is too fatigued to care. In this scenario, Venezuela becomes a permanent gray zone, a black market superpower where the rules of the international system no longer apply. That's not just a loss for the US, it's a loss for the entire Western order. So what's the way forward? The US needs to stop treating Venezuela as a standalone crisis and start treating it as a symptom of a larger the erosion of American influence in its own hemisphere. That means three things. First, the US needs to rebuild its diplomatic toolkit. Sanctions are a blunt instrument, and they've failed. Instead, the US should focus on targeted engagement, working with allies like Colombia and Brazil to create a regional framework for managing the crisis. Second, the US needs to address its own domestic divisions. Venezuela is a political football in Washington, but it's a humanitarian disaster in real life. The American people need to be reminded of that. And third, the US needs to accept that it can't control everything. Sometimes, the best strategy is to contain the damage and wait for the storm to pass. I've seen this movie before. In the 1980s, the US spent billions propping up authoritarian regimes in Central America, only to watch them collapse under the weight of their own corruption. The difference now is that the US is no longer the sole superpower. It's one of many, and its adversaries are playing a longer game. Venezuela isn't just a test of American power, it's a test of American resilience. And right now, the US is failing. Not because it lacks the tools, but because it lacks the will to use them effectively. The question isn't whether the US can fix Venezuela. The question is whether the US can fix itself. And if it can't, then Venezuela won't be the last country to slip through its fingers. It'll just be the first. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela isn't just a failure of policy, it's a failure of imagination. The American foreign policy establishment has spent decades operating on autopilot, recycling the same playbook from the Cold War, the war on drugs, and the post-9/11 era, as if the world hasn't changed. The assumption has always been that if the US applies enough pressure, sanctions, diplomatic isolation, the occasional covert operation, then the target regime will either collapse or capitulate. But in Venezuela, that assumption has been proven wrong in real time, and the costs are piling up. Since 2017, US sanctions have contributed to an economic contraction that makes the Great Depression look like a mild recession. GDP has shrunk by over 75% since Maduro took power. Inflation has hit levels that defy comprehension, peaking at 1,000,000% in 2018, and more than 7 million Venezuelans have fled the country, creating the largest displacement crisis in the Western Hemisphere. And yet, Maduro is still standing. In fact, he's stronger than ever, having outmaneuvered both the opposition and the US at every turn. Here's the uncomfortable: the US has been playing chess while Maduro has been playing poker. Every time Washington doubles down on sanctions, Maduro finds a new patron: Russia, China, Iran, Turkey, even the criminal underworld, to keep his regime afloat. Every time the US recognizes an opposition leader as the legitimate president, Maduro co-opts or crushes them. And every time the US threatens military intervention, Maduro calls their bluff, knowing full well that the American public has no appetite for another war. The result is a stalemate that benefits no one except the regime and its enablers. The US has spent years treating Venezuela as a problem to be solved, when in reality, it's a condition to be managed. And that requires a fundamental shift in strategy, one that the foreign policy blob in Washington is simply not equipped to make. Let me explain why this matters beyond Venezuela's borders. The US has long seen Latin America as its backyard, a region where it could dictate terms without serious challenge. But that era is over. China has become the top trading partner for most of South America, Russia is making inroads with military and energy deals, and even Iran has found a foothold in the region, using Venezuela as a staging ground for its own geopolitical ambitions. In 2022, Russia sent nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela for joint exercises, a move that would have been unthinkable during the Cold War. China, meanwhile, has poured billions into Venezuelan oil infrastructure, securing long-term contracts that lock the US out of the market. And Iran has used Venezuela as a hub for smuggling oil, gold, and even drones, circumventing US sanctions with ease. The message is the US can no longer assume that its dominance in the hemisphere is guaranteed. If it doesn't adapt, it will find itself increasingly marginalized in its own neighborhood. So what are the alternatives? The first is containment. The US needs to accept that Maduro isn't going anywhere anytime soon and shift its focus to limiting his ability to project power. That means working with regional allies to disrupt his illicit networks, drug trafficking, gold smuggling, and cybercrime, while also providing humanitarian aid to the Venezuelan people. It means pressuring China and Russia to stop propping up the regime, not through empty threats, but by offering them a way out. For China, that could mean guaranteeing access to Venezuelan oil without the political baggage. For Russia, it could mean a face-saving exit from its military commitments. The goal isn't to topple Maduro, it's to make his rule so costly that he becomes a liability rather than an asset to his patrons. The second alternative is engagement, but not the kind of engagement that Washington is used to. The US needs to stop treating Venezuela as a pariah state and start treating it as a failed state that needs to be stabilized. That doesn't mean lifting sanctions overnight or recognizing Maduro's legitimacy. It means opening channels of communication, directly or through intermediaries, to negotiate limited concessions, like the release of political prisoners or the resumption of humanitarian aid. It means working with the opposition to ensure that any future transition is inclusive and sustainable, rather than a repeat of the 2019 debacle, when Juan Guaidó was anointed as the great hope of Venezuela, only to be abandoned by his own allies in the US within months. And it means accepting that the road to democracy in Venezuela will be long and messy, with setbacks along the way. The third alternative is the most the US could walk away. Not entirely, but strategically. It could declare victory, having imposed crippling sanctions, exposed Maduro's corruption, and forced him into a corner, and then pivot to other priorities. This would be a high-risk move, but it's not without precedent. In the 1990s, the US effectively gave up on Somalia, allowing it to collapse into a failed state rather than committing to a costly and uncertain intervention. The result was a humanitarian catastrophe, but it also prevented the US from getting bogged down in a quagmire. Venezuela isn't Somalia, but the principle is sometimes the best way to preserve American power is to know when to cut your losses. None of these alternatives are perfect. Containment risks normalizing Maduro's rule. Engagement risks legitimizing his regime. And walking away risks abandoning millions of Venezuelans to their fate. But the status quo is worse. The US is stuck in a cycle of escalation and retreat, with no clear endgame in sight. And the longer this goes on, the more damage it does to American credibility, not just in Latin America, but around the world. I've spent years studying how great powers decline, and one of the most consistent warning signs is when they become obsessed with peripheral crises while ignoring the structural weaknesses at home. The US is dangerously close to that. Venezuela is a symptom of a larger erosion of American statecraft. The tools that worked in the 20th century, military might, economic coercion, diplomatic dominance, are no longer sufficient in a world where power is diffused, where adversaries are more agile, and where the American public is no longer willing to bear the costs of global leadership. The US still has the resources to shape the world in its image, but it no longer has the will. And that's the real crisis. The question isn't whether the US can fix Venezuela. The question is whether the US can fix itself. Can it rebuild its diplomatic core, which has been hollowed out by decades of neglect? Can it bridge its partisan divides long enough to formulate a coherent foreign policy? Can it adapt to a world where power is no longer measured in aircraft carriers and dollar reserves, but in resilience, innovation, and the ability to outmaneuver adversaries in the gray zones of the 21st century? If the answer is no, then Venezuela won't be the last country to slip through America's fingers. It'll just be the first in a long line of failures. And that, in the end, is what Venezuela reveals about American power. It's not that the US is weak. It's that it's lost. Lost its way, lost its confidence, lost its ability to lead. The tragedy is that it doesn't have to be this way. The tools are there. The allies are there. The opportunities are there. But without the will to use them, they might as well not exist. And that's the most damning indictment of all.